Should we be bound by the will of the dead? Should we be bound by our society's institutions? Should we be bound by, say, our Constitution? According to one Thomas Jefferson, the answer to those questions is no. And those questions is what we're going to be looking at in this video, specifically through two letters written between Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. Now, the main letter we'll be looking at is a letter written by Jefferson to Madison on September 6, 1789. Now, the letter is better associated with the phrase, "The earth belongs in usufruct to the living," which is how you can find it if you search it up. I will have all of these sources linked down below, by the way, and I'll also be showing them on screen, so let's get right into it. Now, first, it's important to sort of analyze the context surrounding this letter. As I mentioned, it was written in September of 1789. At that point, Thomas Jefferson was the minister to France. Also at that point, as many of you might know, the French Revolution had just kicked off. And Jefferson was kind of involved in the revolution, although perhaps the representative of another nation, the United States, should not be getting involved in a foreign revolution, but Jefferson seemingly had no qualms about that. So this is a very turbulent period. Jefferson is pretty involved in the revolution, and that context is something that you guys should remember as we go through Jefferson's thoughts on the subject. Now, Jefferson begins this letter by saying that he believes it to be self-evident that the earth belongs in usufruct to the living, and that the dead have neither powers nor rights over it. What he means is that he believes those who are currently alive should control how society is run, and they should not be bound by the will of the dead, those who came before them, or, in fact, those who came afterwards. Now, Jefferson will apply this idea to several different things, which we will look at throughout this letter. Now, the first thing he looks at is land. Jefferson talks about passing down land to one's children, for example, and he makes the point, which would be contentious at the time, that land is not passed down by, say, natural right. There's no natural right to pass one's land down to one's children. Earth belongs to the living. So if you own land while you're living, that's great, but once you're gone, you have no right over it. We pass our land down to our children only through the laws of our society. So if those laws don't exist, then you have no right to pass your land down to somebody else. This would have been a rather contentious idea at the time. Jefferson also applies this idea to debt, aka one should not take more debt than they can repay in their lifetime, and they should not pass on their debt to those who come afterwards. Now, both of these ideas on land ownership and debt, Jefferson says apply to society collectively. In fact, he says everything that applies to the individual also applies to society collectively, because society is made up of individuals. Jefferson confronts this idea using a sort of thought experiment where he looks at different generations and he imagines, what if one generation was born all at once and then they died at the same time? Basically making it so you have one generation and they exist at this point in time, then the next generation exists directly afterwards. It's sort of a simplification of how the world really works, but it also makes it easier to understand what he's saying. By doing this, Jefferson makes the point that if we have our first generation here, they should not take on more debt than they as a society can repay in their lifetimes. And when the second generation begins, they should be bound by no debt, laws, rules that were made up by the first generation. They should have a completely clean slate. In fact, in respect to the different generations and the separation between generations, Jefferson says that by the law of nature, one generation is to another as one independent nation to another. That's how separately he sees different generations. He posits the idea that in respect to debts, he thinks it would be wise that a nation or a constitution would declare that they can take on no more debts than they could pay off within 19 years, aka, to him, a lifetime, so that the future generations are not bound by the debts of the past. Well, listening to this, you might be sort of wondering, well, what about, say, the United States Constitution? Is that not a document, a set of rules that binds future generations? Well, yes, it is, and Jefferson confronts that. He says that on a similar ground, it may be proof that no society can make a perpetual constitution or even a perpetual law. The earth belongs always to the living generation. And so what he says is that every 19 years, which as I said is his, sort of lifetime, every lifetime, the Constitution should expire. Everybody should get together and decide their own rules for the next generation. He basically explicitly says that we should not be bound by the Constitution. He thinks that it should be constantly revised every generation. This is, of course, very differently than how we do things today. Now, there are a number of amendments to our Constitution, but we have, generally speaking, really stuck to following this one document that was written roughly 200 years ago. Jefferson would not have been a fan of that. He would have been pretty horrified, and he would have said, "You haven't rewritten it many times?" But of course we haven't. Jefferson ends his letter by applying some of the ideas he's been writing about to the current situation in France. For example, he writes that this idea of Earth belonging to the living could be used to, say, strip lands away from the church or abolish feudal privileges. Because, sure, those privileges were granted to lords hundreds and hundreds of years ago. If an act of the legislature says, then they can be completely abolished. They've been passed down, which is only by the law of society. They haven't been passed down by natural law. Of course, this would happen during the French Revolution, which Jefferson was certainly a fan of. Jefferson ends his letter by saying, though some may think this is just theoretical speculation, he thinks it's solid. He thinks this is practically applicable. At least that's what he thinks. Now, of course, like I said, this is a letter to James Madison. And while Jefferson and Madison did agree on a lot of things, Madison had some issues with Jefferson's ideas this time. To see Madison's reservations with Jefferson's idea that the earth belongs to the living, we can look at his response to Jefferson on February 4th, 1790. So Madison first looks at it from a practical viewpoint. In fact, that's mainly how he looks at this idea that Jefferson has presented. He basically says that rewriting the Constitution so often would just not be practical. It would cause factional bickering. The Constitution would be changed at the whims of the majority. It's just something that he thinks would not work, and that sort of lines up with the Republican ideology of the time. Keep in mind that Jefferson was more democratic than many of his contemporaries. One of the main points Madison makes is that, and I'll quote it here, "The improvements made by the dead form a charge against the living who take the benefit of them. This charge can no otherwise be satisfied than by executing the will of the dead accompanying the improvements." So the point Madison is making is that, those who once were have created institutions, made rules, laws, they've made improvements upon society. And that sort of creates a debt to the dead from the living. And to fulfill that debt, the living must execute the will of the dead. Similarly, he argues that debt may be incurred for purposes which interest the unborn. So, debt can be taken on to help those who come after us. I think Madison makes some interesting points here. I would say, overall, I definitely agree more with Jefferson that we should not be bound by tradition simply for the sake of it, but I think Madison's right that we do have to think of those who come after. I don't really agree with his argument that we have to execute the will of the dead in order to repay a debt towards them. They're gone. We can't repay them anything. They're already gone. But those future generations, well, they're going to appear one day. And I think we have some sort of responsibility to help them out, or at least to not make things worse. Now, Madison ends off his letter by saying that if Jefferson's ideas were to be implemented, then most of the rights of property would become absolutely defunct. Now, he's right. Jefferson's idea would completely mess with property rights. Maybe they would. Jefferson says that currently land is passed down to our children through the laws of society. So if a society wanted to continue doing that, Jefferson has no issue with that. He just doesn't think that is, natural law. He doesn't think that's a fundamental rule of nature. And we can sort of look at this a different way. In the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson talks about our unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, a lot of the ideas he used in the Declaration are taken from John Locke and a lot of other English philosophers of the time. Now, if you read Locke's natural law theory, Locke lists off life, liberty, and property, right? So Jefferson cognizantly took that idea, removed property from it, which he didn't see as a fundamental right aside life and liberty, and replaced it with pursuit of happiness. So when Madison says that, this could seriously disrupt property rights, one, it may not, it's up to the society, and two, Jefferson may not have an issue with that, at least in theory. Remember, in practice, he was a massive landowner, and I'm sure he wouldn't want his property rights actively disrupted, but at least this is what Jefferson is thinking. He often thought differently than he did, or at least he wasn't able to implement his ideas properly. I think Jefferson makes some interesting points about not being bound by those who are gone, not being bound by tradition simply because it is tradition. I think, fair enough, we should look at those who came before us, look at tradition, analyze it, and see if it's worthy of keeping. If it's not, then we should get rid of it. But this also aligns with some other ideas Jefferson had. Though it is worth noting that, Jefferson wrote this in 1789, and while he would believe this for the rest of his life, he wouldn't really bring it up frequently again, perhaps because it just simply wasn't practical, like he was not going to get anything like this implemented. But it's worth looking at another letter from Jefferson to William Stephen Smith in 1787, so 2 years prior. Jefferson talks about rebellions. In fact, this is a letter that some of you might have heard a very famous quote from. He basically says that, God forbid, we should ever be 20 years without a rebellion. We have that 20 years. It's pretty similar to his every 19 years we should revise or completely abolish and remake our Constitution and our laws. Now he's saying, it's not such a bad thing if every 20 years we have a rebellion. He says, quote, and what country can preserve its liberties if their rulers are not warned from time to time that their people preserve the spirit of resistance, end quote. This sort of lines up with Jefferson's idea that our struggle for liberty is relentless. We have to continually struggle for our freedom or liberty. It's a never-ending fight. And we do kind of get this idea that, the earth belongs to those who are living. I feel like we can sort of see that here, talking about every 20 years we should have another rebellion. The people should assert themselves. Jefferson was very worried about the government falling into tyranny, and he felt the only way to avoid that was through the people being educated and being armed, ready to take up arms to defend themselves and their rights. And the very famous quote from this letter is, quote, the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants, end quote. So, it's very emblematic of Jefferson's entire beliefs on this subject. I bring this letter up simply because I think it's relevant to Jefferson's wider point, and I think we can definitely see some through lines. Like I said earlier, if you want to check out any of these sources, I will have them all linked below in the description. And that brings us to the end of this video. Now, you could go much deeper into the topic. You could take a look at wider Enlightenment philosophy on the idea, but in this video, I specifically wanted to look at these letters between Jefferson and Madison and sort of take a deeper dive into them. But like I said, you should go and read them yourselves because there's a lot more to see. And I do wonder what exactly you guys think about these ideas. Do you think that Jefferson is more right, or do you agree more with Madison? Should we be bound by the will of the dead? Should we do what they wanted simply because they wanted it? Or should we, every so often revise, refresh, abolish the things that came before us, and try to start anew, do our own thing? That's what Jefferson thought. Like I said, people find this particularly interesting because of how it applies to our Constitution. Jefferson believed this in particular, but of course all of our founders believed that the Constitution should be amended over time. And a lot of them would probably be shocked at the lack of amendments we have to this day. And like I said, Jefferson would probably be shocked that we haven't completely rewritten the thing. Now, Jefferson said we shouldn't be bound by those who came before, and I agree, and I also apply that to him. We shouldn't hold his opinion as correct simply because it came from him, a figure who was pretty important in our nation's history. But I do think it's worth looking back at the ideas of our founders and kind of thinking closely about them. Have we applied them? Should we apply them? Have their ideas changed with the context of the modern world, what that they said is still applicable. I think we should do an honest reassessment. We don't need to simply believe things that they told us because they told them to us. We should sort of look critically and do a genuine analysis of what our founders have left to us, or at least that's what I think. I'd be interested to hear from you guys below. Please leave your opinions on everything we talked about in this video. If you enjoyed this video, I'd really appreciate it if you would leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and check out my Patreon, which is linked down below. I hope you guys are all having a good day today, and I will see you all again next time. Goodbye.